I'd like to thank everybody for coming tonight. Just to give you my quick background, I just completed my PhD in 2012, and prior to that I was a personal trainer for about 15 years. And a lot of my research has really focused not on what I'm going to talk about tonight, it's really focused more on the effect of exercise on type 2 diabetes, which I'm going to talk a little bit about tonight. But if anybody has any questions while we're going along, if you want me to explain anything else, just raise your hand and let me know. And I came to this through a kind of accidental meeting with somebody. And when I was in West Virginia beginning in 2012, I happened to meet somebody from the Northern West Virginia Rural Health Education Center, that's a mouthful, and they had just secured a grant along with West Virginia University from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC. It was a community transformation grant, and the CDC, that's kind of big time. And their goal was in West Virginia, which has among the highest rates of obesity and type 2 diabetes, the lowest college graduation rates. What they wanted to do was improve physical activity among middle schoolers. So they were looking for somebody to go out to the school system and to try to convince them to create a strategic plan to incorporate more physical education opportunities into the day, aside from just PE, but into after school extracurricular programs, etc. So that's kind of how I came to the cognitive side of exercise. Prior to that, it really had no relationship or hadn't had an opportunity to study the effect of exercise on cognition. And the first thing I had to do was to educate myself. So I did a couple of things. I went out to the school systems and I wanted to see what's actually going on in a PE class, because it had been about 25 years since I'd been in a PE class myself. And I went out to several schools and I did a very basic thing. I just sat there and I watched the kids and I had a stopwatch with me and I timed them. And one of the scary things that I saw was out of an average class that was 40 to 50 minutes long, the average time that the children were actually in physical activities was 3 to 6 minutes. And I thought that was a little disconcerting. So for all of you that are planning on becoming PE teachers, let that be a lesson to you on how not to run your classrooms. The other thing that I did was go to the scientific literature and start to brush up on, what does the literature say about this? Because I knew when I went out there, what they were really trying to do was decrease the rates of obesity. And if you've ever watched the news before, you know that childhood obesity is on the rise. And I thought if I go out there and say that to them, they're just going to eat me alive. I need to come up with a better reason why I'm going to be trying to convince these people that they should change something in their school system. So that's how I kind of accidentally stumbled on this relationship between exercise and cognition. And I can tell you in my research, there is a strong association between exercise, and I mean that acutely, like right now as you do a bout of exercise, it's going to improve your cognitive ability, and fitness, which is a more long-term adaptation to exercise. So both exercise and fitness are strongly associated with improvements in academic success, and that translates into things like GPAs being higher, standardized test scores being better, attentional behavior in classroom being better, and this significant body of research goes back 20 plus years. And that really kind of flies in the face of PE programs, especially in West Virginia, being cut and being downsized and being kind of relegated to a second class kind of class, if you will. Because when I say the word PE teacher, do you really put that on par with somebody like a math teacher or an English teacher? And I think subconsciously we kind of do that. And we tend to say the word PE teacher with a just in front of it. Just a PE teacher, it's just PE, as if to say that physical education is actually not that important. But as it turns out, and hopefully as I will convince you tonight, that is actually very important. But before we get into that, let's consider where we are as a society. We have kind of accidentally manufactured into our culture, into our society, barriers to movement. And I say accidentally because some of this stuff is kind of good. We are creatures of habit and we are creatures of convenience. We like our cell phones. And all of this collectively has led us to the point where we just don't move as much. And I'm a prime candidate for this. I typically spend most of my day seated now, and occasionally I'll jump up and take a jog around the campus just to get moving a little bit. But if we flash back 100 years, the average person really did not have the opportunity to be inactive. Today, it is just the opposite. We've kind of come full circle in terms of physical activity, and that is having some dire ramifications. And I just want to point out a couple of things here. Number one, I've seen a couple of people tooling around campus with these little things right here. This is like the next generation of the Segway. And even when I look at that, I think, boy, that thing looks pretty cool. I'd like to get on one of those. But what is this doing? It is replacing walking. And I'll give you another example of what's going to be coming down the pike here pretty soon. This thing right here is manufactured by a company called Oculus, which was acquired by Facebook for several $billion recently. And this is an immersive virtual reality headset. So very soon we're going to even replace the few opportunities that we have to actually move around with virtual reality. So even with our cities, I mean, we've constructed cities in which pedestrian activity is minimized, if not outright discouraged. And actually one of the things I like about being in Grand Junction is the fantastic bike trails around here. But when I get on the Fruita Trail, for example, and I'm out there for 2 hours and I see 20 people, I still think that we're not really taking advantage of the few opportunities that we do have to exercise like that. But most cities do not even have anything that's anywhere remotely close to what Grand Junction has. So we're actually pretty lucky here in that regard. And a lot of people suggest that obesity is a problem, and especially childhood obesity is a problem. And I would suggest to you that obesity is not a problem. Obesity is a symptom. The problem is that we don't move enough. Now, for some of you, I'm sure you were thinking, isn't nutrition a part of that? And absolutely, I would grant that, and Dr. Reeder and myself have had long conversations about that. But tonight we're talking about exercise. Let's not lose sight of the fact that nutrition is an important part of this, but for tonight we're going to focus more on exercise. And this movement problem that we have, which is essentially what it boils down to, has presented itself in a couple of interesting ways. Number one, we have this obesity problem, which again is really a symptom, it's not really a problem. And one of the big culprits of that is screen time. The average adolescent spends 7 hours a day in front of a screen, and those screens are very tantalizing. There's a lot of entertainment in those screens. It's very easy to get caught up in this screen world, but it's very difficult to exercise and stare at a screen at the same time. And if you have to choose between getting sweaty on the treadmill and looking at a screen, very frequently the screen is going to win out. And this movement problem has actually translated into some things that are not so predictable as well. And I'm going to tell you about something that you probably have not heard about before, but in 2010, about 50 retired generals and retired admirals were so concerned with something that they got together and they wrote this thing called a white paper, and they published the white paper hopefully to get the public and the media's attention. And in this white paper, they said something that was not extraordinary. They said that children coming into the military today are so overweight that we can't actually accept them, which was not surprising at all. But they went on to say that they considered this a threat to national security. That's kind of amazing. The other thing that they said, which was kind of even a surprise even to me, was they said the kids coming into the military today have no basic motor skills. They can't do things like tumble effectively, or they can't do a set of jumping jacks. And for those of you that are over the age of 40, doing something like a jumping jack is just, you don't even have to think about it, it's so second nature to you because you learned it when you were 4 or 5 years old. If you were to attempt to teach a jumping jack to somebody that was 25 years old that didn't learn it when they were 4, that's actually a really complex motor skill. So they also considered this a threat to national security. So we're kind of going down a strange and a very new path when we manufacture physical activity out of our daily routine. More on the adult side of things, we now have over 12% of the population that falls into the category of diabetes, the lion's share of that, about 95% or so, being type 2 diabetes. And type 2 diabetes is the classic example of a hypokinetic disease. That is a disease that is associated with not enough movement. And type 2 diabetes is also called a disease of lifestyle. It's a lifestyle-related disease. And essentially, there are two really important components to that. There's the nutrition component, but then there is also the activity component. And I want you to think about activity as a kind of tune-up for the body. And I want you to replace the word fitness with another word, efficiency. Whenever we have a fit body, we have a physiologically efficient body. On the converse of that, whenever we have an unfit body, we have a physiologically inefficient body. And the body is made up of 11 systems. The more efficient these systems are, the better the body will work. Type 2 diabetes is a good example of this. We all have sugar floating around through our bloodstream. The better you are at controlling that sugar, chances are the healthier you're going to be. The less fit you are, the tougher it's going to be to control that sugar. And we kind of descend along this path of inefficiency until eventually we're going to call that type 2 diabetes, and this is an inability to regulate blood sugar levels. This is a disease of inefficiency. Now, let's throw on top of that, more than 1 out of every 10 people has diabetes right now in this country. An additional 35% fall into this category of pre-diabetes. So some diseases are relatively easy in a sense. HIV, for example. You have the HIV virus in your body or you do not. It's kind of a light switch. It's either on or it's off. With diabetes, it's kind of a long, slow slide into inefficiency, and at some point along the way, the doctor is going to clinically diagnose somebody with diabetes. But it's not an either-or kind of thing. It's not a light switch. It's kind of that slow descent into that, and 35% of the population right now is kind of in the middle of that slow descent. They're sliding down toward type 2 diabetes. And if we add those two figures together, we get almost half of the adult population in the country that either has diabetes or is on the way to having diabetes. Now, diabetes in some cultures is a rarity. In our culture, it's becoming the norm, which is kind of scary. So let's go back and let's start digging into the effect of exercise a little bit. And I'm going to sum exercise physiology up for you in one simple sentence. And my students have probably heard this about 68 times so far this semester, because it took me a long time to kind of get this concept. And once I did, I had a framework into which I could plug all of these facts that I was trying to memorize about exercise physiology. So it's this: your body adapts to what you do. That's it. That's the whole thing. So my semester-long exercise physiology class, all I'm doing is explaining the whys, the wheres, and the whats of the basic rule of fitness: your body adapts to what you do. And we could just as easily call that the fundamental rule of physiology. This applies to pretty much everything that we do. Why do we exercise? Why do we try to become bigger, faster, stronger? Well, how do we do that? We apply a stimulus to the body responds, the body adapts, and we become more flexible, we get bigger muscles, we can run faster, etc. But it really is that simple. But this is a knife, this is an adage that cuts both ways. Just like we can apply a stimulus to the body to change it in a positive way, we can also apply a stimulus and we can get a negative change. And the kind of good news, bad news is that you are always adapting. You really have no choice in that. As you are sitting there right now, you are adapting. If you have a job in which you sit all day long, like I kind of do now, your body is adapting to what you do. And here's one of the things that we face. We get into this situation right here, where we lift the legs up, we're sitting in our chair, we sit in our car, we go home and we sit. And what does that do? That puts our hip flexors, for example, into a shortened position, and what do they do over time? They adapt. Now, when your hip flexors are short, you have two choices. They can either pull your legs up off the ground, and you can defy gravity, or they're going to start to tilt your hips forward, and we're going to get that anterior tilt to the hips, which eventually is going to put a little extra stress on our lower back, and then we develop back problems, etc. So that's kind of an example of a negative adaptation. But that's what our body does. We adapt to what we do. We adapt to everything that the body is exposed to on a continual basis. We don't get the opportunity to say, I'm going to adapt to this and I'm not going to adapt to that. So we can take that principle and we can apply it in a very positive way. And let me give you one quick study example of this that is a classic study that virtually nobody has heard of. It's called the Dallas Bed Rest Study. And it's kind of shocking to me that nobody has heard of this, because it's such a classic example of how quickly the body can adapt in a positive or in a negative way. So in 1966, researchers at a medical school in Dallas went out and they rounded up a bunch of young, healthy, fit, lean guys. They put them through a battery of physical fitness tests, and one of the most important things that they did was this thing called a VO2 max test, which is something that we do regularly in the Human Performance Lab. And you put them on a treadmill, they put a hose in their mouth, and basically they measure their ability to consume oxygen, because that's the truest measure of your aerobic fitness. And then they did something kind of cruel. They put them in bed for 3 weeks. They were on bed rest. If they wanted to go to the bathroom, they used a bedpan or they got into a wheelchair. They were as sedentary as it is possible to be on the face of the earth for 3 weeks. And then at the end of 3 weeks, they got these 20-year-old, healthy, young, fit guys up, and they put them through the same battery of tests again. And what they found was, not too surprisingly, all of their scores went down, but their VO2 max, their ability to consume and use oxygen, which is truly a reflection of your cardiovascular system, your heart and your blood vessels, it went down 26%. Now, for those of you that happen to be in maybe my exercise physiology class, you kind of have a point of reference for that. But for everybody else, let me put that in a different kind of perspective for you. 40 years later, the researchers went out and found the same guys. Now they're 60 years old. They brought them into the lab. They didn't put them on bed rest. That would have been really cruel and unusual punishment at that point. But they put them through the same tests. Their VO2 max, their aerobic fitness when they were 60, was the same as after 3 weeks of bed rest when they were 20. So let me say that a different way. 3 weeks of bed rest aged their cardiovascular function for decades. That's how profoundly and how quickly we can get adaptations. And that's kind of both a good thing and both, it's also kind of scary too. Because just like we can get out of shape that quickly, well, we're not going to get into shape that quickly, but we do change and adapt pretty quickly. So let me kind of give you a thumbnail view of what we know about the impact of exercise on cognition right now. On a physiological level, exercise does a couple of things. It does an important thing called neurogenesis. Genesis means to create. Neuro refers to neurons or nerves. And basically your brain is a gigantic conglomeration of different nerves that are talking to each other. And the way that they talk to each other is that they create this thing called a synapse. So exercise improves not only the quantity of neurons that we have, but their ability to communicate with each other, synaptogenesis. So we have more neurons, and these extra neurons are talking to everybody, which is generally a good thing. We also have, that supports all of this, something called angiogenesis. Angio refers to blood vessels. Whenever we exercise, we increase our ability to transport blood, and that's going to be a really, really important point. We're going to come back and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But collectively, what this results in is an improvement in something called executive function. And when I say the word think to you, everything that conjures up probably falls under the category of executive function. So our ability to plan, our working memory, our ability to strategize, these are examples of executive function. These are, it's kind of an umbrella term for the higher order thinking capabilities that we have. So let's take a look at a little bit of research now and see if the research validates everything that I've told you that exercise actually does for us. And let's start at the beginning. Let's start with children. Now, this was a study that was done in about 200 7 to 11-year-olds. And what they did was they rounded up these kids and they randomly assigned them to one of three groups. And all of these children were overweight and sedentary to begin with. And they put people into three groups, one of which was the control group. And the control group basically did nothing. They had tests at the beginning and tests at the end. And the tests were relatively simple. They did a math achievement test with the kids. They did a comprehensive test of executive function to see how well their brains were working. And then they did a novel thing. They put them into a functional MRI. And an fMRI assesses brain activity based on blood flow patterns. Okay? So we have our control group that they do the test in the beginning, then they go home and they live their normal life. And then we have two intervention groups. We have a low dose group and a high dose group. The low dose group went to an after school program in which they did 20 minutes of aerobically oriented exercise. They did soccer and they did running games. Basically, they kept them active for 20 minutes. The high dose group did essentially the same thing, but they got 2 bouts of 20 minutes of exercise separated by a little break. Okay, so we have the control group that did basically nothing. They stayed sedentary. The low dose group did 20 minutes of exercise after school. The high dose group did 40 minutes of exercise after school. And this was a 13-week study. At the end of the 13 weeks, they brought all the kids back in. They did the fMRI, the math achievement test, and the test of executive function again. And what we see here is what we would call a linear pattern. And what this translates into is the high dose group had improvements in math and executive function of 2 and 3%. The math was actually a 3% improvement, and the executive function was a 2% improvement. Now, that may or may not sound impressive to you, but keep in mind, it was a short-term study. It was only about 3 months. It was in very young children, and they weren't doing too much. And the max they were doing 40 minutes of exercise. So if this is accurate, if exercise really does improve the way that we think, if we did something on a longer term scale, we should see even more compounded results. And actually that's what we do see. What we're looking at here is in this study, this was a study that began with 24 schools in northeastern Kansas. And they had 24 schools, and they divided the schools down into two groups. There was the control group, and they had one intervention group. And at the beginning of the study, which lasted 3 years, they did tests of math ability, spelling ability, reading ability, and they compared them to the national standards, the national averages. And then they took the other 12 schools, and they assigned them to a kind of enhanced exercise group. So everybody in this study, all 24 schools, they were doing 60 minutes of PE every week, which is not very much. That's two 30-minute PE sessions per week. The intervention group, which is in the black up here, they added an additional 90 minutes of PE, but they didn't do it in a PE class, and this is kind of an important differentiation. They got them in the math class, in the English class, in the history class, and 9 times every week they got the kids up for 10 minutes. They did a little bit of physical activity, they sat them back down, and they continued with the lesson. And they started with 2nd and 3rd graders, and they followed them until they were in 5th and 6th grade. And this is what we found at the end of that study. Well, not we, I wasn't part of this study. But the control group is in gray. And compared to the national standards, they kind of broke even. I mean, they lost a little bit in reading, they gained a little bit in math, they lost a little bit on their composite score. We can fairly say that they basically broke even in comparison to the national standards. The exercise group, on the other hand, had a 5% improvement in their composite score, and 8% improvement in their math score. Their spelling scores went up. That looks kind of impressive, but I want you to consider something. Consider the actual impact of this. The exercise intervention group took 90 minutes out of every week, and they took it away from math and spelling and reading, and they dedicated it to physical activity. So if we do the math on this, that's 90 minutes a week times 36 weeks in a year. That comes out to about 54 hours a year. This was a study that lasted for 3 years. So what that comes out to is the kids in the exercise group had 27 fewer days of actual instruction, and yet they saw significant improvements over the control group, which had an extra 27 days of instruction. That almost doesn't make sense. But that kind of tells us something about exercise. When we dedicate a little bit of extra time to exercise and take it away from math, English, and spelling, we're not really robbing Peter to pay Paul, we're getting an amplified effect there. So essentially what we're saying is that exercise is a kind of brain boost. And I'll give you a kind of sideways example of that. If you think back to, for some of you, you might only have to think back a week or a couple days, but if you think back to a time when you were in high school or in college and you had a really important exam and you studied a lot for it, and you went in and you sat down and the teacher slid the test in front of you, and all of a sudden you just blanked on everything, okay? That was the effect of stress. Stress makes you stupid is a kind of simple way to remember that. And why does stress make you stupid? Because stress decreases blood flow to the part of the brain that governs executive function. That's called the prefrontal cortex. Exercise does just the opposite. So exercise is a kind of opposite of stress on the brain. So we could think of that as a kind of supercharging of the brain, if you will. We're getting that brain into an optimal state for learning, or just for cognition. All right, now let's go in the opposite direction here for a moment. Dementia is a kind of catch-all or umbrella term for a cognitive decline, of memory loss that leads to the point where this cognitive decline kind of gets in the way of just activities of daily living. It impairs your ability just to live. And Alzheimer's disease accounts for the largest chunk of dementia. It accounts for about 60 to 80%. And we don't exactly know what causes Alzheimer's disease, but we do know that only a tiny percentage of people that get Alzheimer's disease, we can attribute this to something that is genetic, something that's passed along through the genes. So most cases of Alzheimer's disease are what's called idiopathic. We don't really know what causes it. But one of the things that we do know is that exercise and fitness has a modifying impact on this. Not only that, but let me take a step back. Osteopenia is a precursor to osteoporosis. So before somebody has osteoporosis, they're going to have osteopenia. Just like before somebody has diabetes, they are going to have prediabetes. It's again, that's kind of that inefficient slide into physiological chaos, if you will. Before we get to the point of Alzheimer's disease, a person's going to pass through one of these precursor stages, which we call mild cognitive impairment, or MCI. And we know that exercise has a modifying and preventative effect on both mild cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's disease. Now, why would that be? Because when we're looking at a totally different population here. In children, we could say there's a developmental aspect to that, but in older adults, why would that be? And the short answer to that is we don't exactly know yet, but I'm going to suggest to you that one of the primary reasons for this is blood flow. Everything is going to come back to blood flow. This is the central feature of so many things. And what I mean by that is when we have really good blood flow and we are physiologically efficient, we perform better and we have better health. If we do anything that impairs blood flow, it's going to impair both health and physical performance. Everything kind of passes through the central point of blood flow. And a good way to remember that is, so goes the heart, so goes the head. And what I mean by that is, I'm sure everybody here has heard the term atherosclerosis before and the very non-technical term of hardening of the arteries. So if you picture the arteries, and I have a couple of arteries up here, in a normal, healthy artery, well, arteries do a couple of things for us. Number one, it's a kind of conduit system. So it's kind of like the plumbing in your house. We're going to transport stuff through these arteries. But another important function that they have is that they serve as a kind of surge protector, if you will. Because every time your heart beats, your heart ejects blood out into your arterial system, and the arteries have to swell and accommodate this extra blood, and then as the heart rests in between, they're going to come back down. Now, normally when we're at rest, the arteries are not going to swell very much, but occasionally we'll do something like exercise, and we're going to pump a lot more blood than we normally do. So that arterial system has to be able to contain and to hold and to absorb this surge in blood. Now, if we do this on a regular basis, we train the arteries just the same way that we train the muscles. As a matter of fact, inside all of the arteries, we have a layer of muscle in there. It's not under our conscious control, not like your biceps is, but it's still a layer of muscle. So the more that we train the arterial system, the better it gets at absorbing these surges in blood flow. If we only do this once or twice a year, when it happens to snow, for example, and we have to go out and we have to shovel the walk, now we're going to have these surges in blood flow, but the arteries are not going to be prepared to handle it. And what we're going to do is we're going to create these little nicks on the inside. And just like if you cut yourself, you're going to develop a scab on your skin, effectively the same thing happens on the inside of the arteries. And whenever we develop these little nicks on the inside of the arteries, we kind of impair or we break down the kind of Teflon coating on the inside of the arteries. Normally they're nice and smooth and they allow the blood to flow through relatively easily. But when we create these imperfections, we start to build up what's called plaque on the inside. And I want you to think about it. If you've ever seen old pipes before and you see that gunk that accumulates on the inside of the pipes, effectively that's what's happening in our arteries. And that gunking up causes the arteries to become stiff and inflexible. Just the opposite of what we actually want. Because now when we have a gunked up artery and we create this surge of blood flow, there's no way that that artery can now accommodate that, so it dramatically drives up our blood pressure, and then we can get to the point where maybe we rupture one of these plaques here, and then that leads us to a heart attack and potentially a stroke. So again, kind of everything comes back to the point of blood flow. Now, speaking of blood flow, let's take a look at a couple of studies here. And let's see if fitness actually does affect blood flow. In this study, they looked at 307 adult males, and they categorized these people in one of two ways. They were either sedentary or they were competitive athletes. Now, they weren't like Olympic level competitive athletes. They were the kind of people that go out and they'll run a road race, a 5K, a 10K, maybe a half marathon on the weekends. And they did, again, a VO2 max with these people, and they assessed their aerobic fitness. And then they did another more advanced test. They assessed what's called the MCAV. That's the velocity of blood flowing through the middle cerebral artery. We're assessing how well blood flows through the arteries of the brain. And what they found was two important things. Number one, blood flow velocity declined over time in everybody, regardless of fitness level. However, when they compared the sedentary people to the aerobically trained people, they saw at any given age point there was about a 17% difference between the trained and the untrained people. And what I mean by that is if we were looking at two people that were each 50 years of age, one was sedentary, one was aerobically trained, there's going to be about a 17% difference between their blood flow velocities. Now, 17% might not sound like a whole lot, but that was the equivalent of 10 years in terms of blood flow velocity. So let me say that again. If we were comparing a 50-year-old trained person and a 50-year-old sedentary person, the 50-year-old trained person had the blood flow velocity of a sedentary person that was 40. So if we are willing to say that being sedentary is normal, we could truly say that being aerobically trained has an anti-aging effect. Now that's if we're willing to accept that being sedentary is normal, which hopefully we're not willing to accept that. Okay, now, if being aerobically fit leads to better blood flow, does better blood flow necessarily lead to less cognitive decline? Well, let's take a look at that. This was a 4-year-long study in which they enrolled 423 people that already had mild cognitive impairment, and they followed them over the course of 4 years. And essentially what they were doing is they wanted to quantify how many out of these 423 people were going to advance to the point of having Alzheimer's disease. And they also wanted to assess blood flow. So at the very beginning of the study, they did, again, an assessment of the large intracranial arteries to assess blood flow, and they categorized people in one of three ways. How blocked were their arteries? Were their arteries relatively clean and had less than a 20% blockage? Well, they called that a grade 1 blockage or a grade 1 stenosis. If they were more than 20% but less than 40%, okay, so we're getting some gunk on the inside of the arteries now. They called that a grade 2 stenosis, and anybody that had more than 40% blockage, which would be like this artery over here, they called that a grade 3 stenosis. Now, what are the odds that the people with the greatest amount of stenosis or the greatest amount of blockage in their arteries are going to progress to Alzheimer's disease at a faster rate? Well, as it turns out, it was a pretty good relationship there. And if we look at a couple of things up here, the MMSE is the Mini Mental State Exam. This is an assessment of cognitive capacity or cognitive ability. And then over here we have the ADL scale. ADL stands for Activities of Daily Living. So can you do the things that a person must do simply to take care of themselves? And when we look at the grade 1 people, the people that had the least amount of blockage, they're in the black up there, basically they kind of stayed the same on the MMSE. Okay, their cognitive ability went down just a little bit, but it wasn't clinically or statistically significant. The people with the grade 2 blockage, they went down at a faster rate, and the people with the grade 3 blockage, the most amount of intracranial artery blockage, they went down the fastest. As a matter of fact, their hazard ratio was 2.9. And what that means was they were about 3 times as likely to progress from mild cognitive impairment to Alzheimer's disease as people that had less blockage. Okay? They were progressing at 3 times the rate. And effectively what happened was as cognitive abilities went down, we saw an equal decline in the activities of daily living. So basically their functional capacity declined at essentially the same rate as their cognitive ability. However, there was a kind of preserving effect. The easier the blood flow was, the better the blood flow was, the lesser the chance that we're going to have any kind of decline over the course of 4 years. All right, let's take a look at one more piece of evidence here. Now, for some of my students here, this will be a review for you, hopefully, but for everybody else, any one study really doesn't mean all that much. And anytime you hear somebody say, a recent study proved, you should just automatically stop listening because they probably don't really know what they're talking about. There's so many limitations to any one study that a study, all it does is really provide one piece of the puzzle. However, a meta-analysis is a different kind of study. A meta-analysis is a study of studies. So in this study, the authors went out and they found 16 other studies that were looking at the effect of physical activity on the odds of developing mild cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's disease. So in this instance, a meta-analysis is a much more powerful kind of study. And in their meta-analysis, what they found was physical activity, and this was a range of physical activity exercises, some as little as 2 times a week, some as many as 5 times a week. But what they found was people that were exercising on a regular basis had a 45% reduced rate of developing Alzheimer's disease and a 28% lower chance of developing dementia of any kind, although Alzheimer's disease is the most common kind of dementia. Okay, we've established some things here. Exercise and fitness has a relationship with cognitive development in children, which translates into improved executive function, which then translated into improvements in academic success. So we know that it works for children. We've also established that fitness level is related to cerebral blood flow. The better your blood flow is, the better your brain works, and that has translated into a reduced risk of dementia. So how do we put this together in a meaningful way? How do you create an action plan for yourself, for your friends, for your clients, for your patients in order to reap the cognitive benefits of exercise? Well, unfortunately, at this point, as the researchers like to say, we need more research. So there is no specific cognitive enhancing exercise prescription that I can pass on to you. However, what I can say is this: the American College of Sports Medicine sets guidelines for health promotion. Typically, the research follows the American College of Sports Medicine guidelines, and that's the research that we've been talking about tonight. So we're going to talk about the American College of Sports Medicine's guidelines for health promotion, which seem to give us the benefits of cognitive enhancement. And we have a simple mnemonic to remember exercise prescription, and it's the FIT-T principle, F-I-T-T. It stands for frequency, intensity, time, and type. So as long as you're taking care of all 4 of those variables, you are effectively programming exercise either for yourself or for somebody else. So how many days a week should we be exercising? The American College of Sports Medicine says most days of the week, as little as 3, as many as 7, but there's an intensity-dependent relationship here. And what I mean by that is the harder you are working out, the less frequently you can get away with it. But the lower the intensity of what you're doing, the more often you should be doing it. So if your exercise is walking for 20 or 30 minutes a day at a relatively moderate pace, you can do that every day. On the other hand, if you're going out and running 2 or 3 miles as hard as you can, maybe 3, possibly 4 days a week would be good for you. If you're kind of crazy and doing something like a CrossFit workout, probably 3 days a week is going to be sufficient for you. Does anybody do CrossFit? Nobody does CrossFit? Okay. It's a very high intensity style of workout. All right, the most important concept here, and mentally I want you to put an asterisk by this. Intensity is the most important concept out of the frequency, time, and type of exercise. And here's what I mean by that. How do we establish intensity? Well, there's lots of ways that we can do that. We can wear a heart rate monitor, but a simpler way to do that is something called the talk test. And what I mean by that is if in the middle of your workout you can carry on a seamless conversation with your friends, kind of like I'm doing right now, you're probably exercising at a low to moderate intensity, which is perfectly fine. On the other hand, if you have to stop and catch your breath in the middle of a conversation, you're probably exercising vigorously. And one of the explosions in research that we've had over the last 10 to 12 years has been in investigating the intensity of exercise. And essentially what we're finding is results seem to be intensity dependent. And what I mean by that is if we can crank up the intensity of what we're doing, we can crank up the results, the adaptations that we're getting physiologically. And this has really kind of shaken up exercise science in a very interesting way. And I'll give you an example. Of this. There's one test that we do in the lab. It's called the Wingate test. Has anybody here done the Wingate test before? Okay. It also goes by the name the pedal till you puke test. It's only 30 seconds, but it's the hardest 30 seconds that you're ever going to have in your life. They put you on a bike, they crank up the resistance, and you just go as hard as you can and as fast as you can for 30 seconds. It's kind of a cruel test. A researcher about 12 years ago turned that into an actual workout paradigm. So he has people come into the lab and he has them do 4 to 6 repeated sprints 2 or 3 days a week. But when you do the actual volume of exercise, it's only 30 seconds, but even if you're doing it 6 times, that's only 3 minutes. If you do that 3 times a week, the actual volume of exercise is only 9 minutes. So it's a very, very low volume, but very, very high intensity exercise. And what we found through repeated studies is that doing this super high intensity exercise is just as good as doing 1, 2, 3 hours of exercise a week. But you got to crank up the intensity. So there is that intensity dependent relationship. And we see this in I'm going to come back to this slide and explain something in a moment. We see this in the American College of Sports Medicine guidelines. And what I mean by that is, look at this intensity dependent relationship here. Ooh, my pointer's dying. If we want to do moderate intensity exercise, they recommend 2.5 hours a week. If you want to do vigorous intensity exercise, they say 75 minutes is good. So when we crank up the intensity, we can cut the duration in half. So there is that intensity dependent relationship. All right, now let me back up one step here because I want to explain something. Also tied into the intensity is something that technically we call EPOC, or excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. And an easier way to remember this is the afterburn. And what I mean by that is at the end of your workout, your breathing doesn't automatically come down to baseline. At the end of your workout, you're still kind of breathing heavy. Well, there's 2 components to this afterburn. There's the really obvious component, which is that extra breathing that you're doing at the end of your workout. But then there's a really subtle component. And sometimes this can last up to 24 hours. This also is intensity dependent. If your workout is walking for 30 minutes at a moderate intensity, your afterburn is going to be pretty small. On the other hand, if you're going out and you're doing repeated sprints, you're doing heavy weight training, you're doing CrossFit, you're doing something really intense, your afterburn might last 4, 5, 12, research suggests maybe up to 24 hours. And what I mean by that is for that 24-hour period, your metabolism is still elevated. And that's going to be an important concept that we're going to see coming up in a couple of slides here. So the afterburn can be a good thing. All right, we talked about the time there and the type of exercise. And I'll tell you a couple of things about this, but I'll give you a second to read that one. The only workout that counts is the one that gets done. So with that said, type is not super important. However, from a cognitive enhancement perspective, we want exercise that emphasizes aerobic activity. That means you get out, you do something that's going to make your heart work hard, which is going to pump blood around your body at a very rapid rate, and we're going to sustain that for a little period of time. Like going out for a vigorous walk, a vigorous jog. However, I want to throw another concept in there. One of the interesting things that we're seeing in the research that's looking into cognition and exercise is that, number one, aerobic exercise is hands down the best. We got to do that. We got to get the blood flowing because everything is central to blood flow. Secondary to that, though, we're finding, and this is kind of a relatively new aspect of cognition and exercise, we're finding that neuromotor exercises are very important. Something about stimulating the motor cortex in the brain, somehow it links to the prefrontal cortex and we get a stimulating effect out of that. So what do I mean by neuromotor exercises? I mean things that actually challenge you. Challenge you more than just physically. Like walking on the treadmill can be a challenge physically, but it's not really a challenge mentally. Yoga requires flexibility, balance, and strength. Same thing with Tai Chi and Pilates. Mountain biking. Haven't done that for a long time, but I can tell you from experience over the last 8 weeks, when you're going fast down a trail and there's lots of rocks and lots of places to fall over and hurt yourself, you are mentally cued into exactly what's happening right in front of you. If you're not, you're going to wind up on the ground bouncing across rocks like I've done recently. So mountain biking would be a good example. Rock climbing would be a good example. There's problem solving in rock climbing. Rock climbing is kind of like a vertical dance. And I want to throw another concept out here. Exercise helps us both acutely in the moment and chronically. And I'll give you a quick example of the acute impact. If you exercise on a regular basis, you might have noticed that you get some of your best ideas while you're moving. This I typically I try to keep a notebook with me when I exercise, but that's not always possible. And sometimes I'll try to take notes on my phone, which is really difficult because the screen is glass and I'm sweaty and I'm sweating all over it. But when we increase that blood flow to the brain, we increase the ability of the brain to work. It's a kind of anti-stress mechanism. Stress is going in the opposite direction. Stress decreases blood flow to the prefrontal cortex, whereas exercise actually increases it. So in the moment, we actually get a benefit, a cognitive benefit. Your brain works better when we have better blood flow. Also, we get a chronic adaptation. So chronically over time, we adapt to exercise, which allows better blood flow to the brain too. But I want to leave you, this is not my last slide, but I want to leave you with one important concept from this slide anyway, and it's this. Your most important workout is your last one. You're kind of living off your last workout. That's because the shelf life of the body is relatively short. It's 7 days or less. And specifically when it comes to exercise, research has validated the shelf life is probably somewhere between 3 and 5 days. And what I mean by that is the effect of a single bout of exercise is going to go 48, 72 hours. If it's really intense, we might push it a little bit past that. An example of that is in type 2 diabetes. The fundamental flaw in type 2 diabetes is an inability to regulate how much sugar is floating around in your bloodstream. We always have some floating around out there. If you didn't, you'd be dead. A single bout of exercise exerts a glucose lowering effect for 24 to 48 hours. Again, intensity, if the intensity is high, it might actually extend to 72 days. But we could say the same thing about blood pressure control. So the most important workout is your last one. You're living off of that last workout. So while we do have these chronic adaptations, and that's a good thing, we don't want to skip workouts because you don't achieve a certain level of fitness and then stop exercising and then just maintain that. That doesn't happen. Your body is either getting more fit or it's becoming less fit. So it's a kind of roller coaster ride, if you will. And if you're exercising on a regular basis, it's more of a kind of, not a roller coaster ride so much as a kind of upward drive. And we're increasing that physiological efficiency. So each workout kind of builds on the last one. But if the last one was 6 months ago, there's nothing to build on. So I want you to consider that. You're either becoming more fit or you're becoming less fit. Okay? We don't want to be on that roller coaster ride. We need to have workouts every 72 hours or more frequently. So I want to leave you with one thought, and then maybe you'll see if you have any questions. We're kind of bringing a concept to the campus called exercise is medicine. This is something that the American College of Sports Medicine founded a few years ago, and nothing could be further from the truth. That was a slip of the tongue there. Nothing could be more true. Exercise really is medicine. And what I mean by that is if we could synthesize down into a single pill all of the benefits of exercise, it would blow out of the water any other 10 medications. And maybe one of these days, science is going to actually synthesize into a pill all the benefits of exercise. But given the complexity of the human body and given what we know about how the human body works, that's not going to happen in my lifetime. And even for those of you guys that are in my class now and like 20 years old, I don't think it's going to happen in your lifetime either. So the next best thing that we have is actual exercise. 200 years from now, they're going to be able to drop a pill. They're not going to have treadmills anymore. But that's not going to happen for any of us.